This is your daily dose of all things royal. Welcome back, my gorgeous, good looking friends. I'm going to take you back to May of 2021. Let's pause and think back. Where were we? What were we doing? And what was happening at the time? Well, in 2021, we were in the midst of this pandemic, and Prince Philip had just passed away, as well as Meghan and Harry went on Oprah and lied through their teeth, calling the royal family racists, even though now Harry denies that Meghan ever said the word racist, but we know what she meant. So when this went down, Harry ended up on the Dax Shepard podcast or Armchair podcast, and that's where he said that the First Amendment was bonkers. Now, at the time, I think a lot of people were pissed off, well, particularly conservatives, because here we have this Brit coming to the United States, and here he is spewing his mouth off when he has no business to be doing so, as well as talking about misinformation. And it was announced that he was going to be a part of the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder. You know, we all know this, right? Anyhow, at the time when he said it, I think a lot of us were thinking, man, Harry's off his rocker. Or is he really that thick and stupid to be so bold to say something like this? Remember, Meghan and Harry have been saturating the media on a daily basis with complete nonsense. So at the time, we just chalked it up as more nonsense. Let's review exactly what his words were. I've got so much I want to say about the First Amendment, as I sort of understand it, but it is bonkers. The former senior royal confessed. I don't want to start going down the First Amendment route because that's a huge subject and one which I don't understand because I've only been here a short time. But you can find a loophole in anything. You can capitalize or exploit what's not said rather than uphold what is said. I believe we live in an age now where you've got certain elements of the media redefining to us what privacy means. That's a massive conflict of interest. If you were like me at the time, you probably didn't get past the line of him calling the First Amendment bonkers. Everything else didn't actually make any kind of sense. But now it does, and it's actually quite mind-blowing. Do you remember in September 2020 when Harry and Meghan sat on that bench encouraging people to go vote, saying that it's the most important election of our lifetime, emphasizing that. And Harry starts going off about misinformation and disinformation. We have to stop hate speech. And in our community at the time, we were all up in arms saying that Harry should not be interfering in our politics nor speaking about our elections. And, we made a fuss about that. In fact, I think a lot of us had written to the Queen asking her to strip them of their titles, but no such thing happened. Anyhow, we felt that there was something fundamentally wrong about this, and, it happened, and the royal family did nothing. Now, going back to what Harry said on the Dax Shepard podcast was you can capitalize or exploit what's not said rather than uphold what is said. They knew what they were doing here, even though they didn't name a specific candidate. What they said directly was against Trump. It's not a secret that Meghan is not a fan of Trump. When she was a working royal, if we want to call it that, not only was Meghan very vocal about Trump prior to marrying Harry, we can't forget that she snubbed her own president when he came to visit Buckingham Palace and the Queen. We all know that Harry follows his wife, but also, too, Harry didn't like Donald Trump because he refused to pay their security. These two knew exactly what they were doing, and Harry was getting to experience right there what freedom of speech meant. So I want to show you something. On October 9th, 2020, the media all of a sudden became flooded with Harry and Meghan going on a double date with David Foster and Catherine McPhee. And then there was other things that they were putting out there about Archie. And, again, it was all of this distraction and noise that they were forcing down our throats and saturating the media with. As you can see, it's the traditional leftist media outlets that have dominated this headline. Now, this video was not supposed to happen today, but it happened because I was working on a separate video and I stumbled across something that I hadn't seen before. Now, I vaguely remember reading about this in a newspaper article, but I never actually saw the congressional letter that was sent by Jason Smith of Missouri to the British ambassador. I think it's worth us looking at it because I'm sure many of you didn't see this letter. And I believe that's because Meghan at the time had her PR machine trying to suppress the news about this. At least in the United States, many, I am pretty sure, did not see this. I think it's very important we revisit this. Jason Smith writes, Dear Ambassador Pierce, I am writing to express concern with their Royal Highnesses, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, and their continued interference in the United States presidential election. As you know, the British royal family has long observed a policy of strict neutrality in regard to political matters. I am therefore concerned by the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's recent comments regarding the United States presidential election, especially given international conversations surrounding foreign interference in our elections and the Duke's status as a guest of the United States. Last month, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex recorded a joint broadcast urging American citizens to register to vote and to reject hate speech, misinformation, and online negativity. The Duchess of Sussex, whose political opinions are thinly disguised and widely reported, went so far as to label the 2020 election the most important election of our lifetime. These actions represent a serious breach of the British royal family's policy of political neutrality and an inappropriate act of domestic interference by one of our closest allies. Additionally, while I understand the Duke and Duchess no longer utilize the style of His or Her Royal Highness, they nevertheless retain these prefixes and remain known as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It is also my understanding the royal family has stated these comments were made in a personal capacity, and the Duke and Duchess are no longer working members of the royal family. However, it is my view the titles and privileges they retain by permission of Her Majesty the Queen, given with the advice and consent of her government, prevent the Duke and Duchess from separating comments made in a personal capacity from their official position within the British royal family. Therefore, by allowing the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to retain their titles and these political comments to continue, the British government is effectively condoning interference in the 2020 United States presidential election from officials at the highest level of the British establishment. I respectfully request the British government ensure the Duke and Duchess of Sussex no longer attempt to interfere in our election or be stripped of all titles, styles, and privileges which they currently retain. I respectfully request you convey these concerns to both Her Majesty the Queen and to Her Majesty's government. Respectfully, Jason Smith. Now, I have spent the majority of the day today searching high and low to see if there was a response either from the ambassador, the British government, and even Her Majesty the Queen. And sadly, there isn't any. I would really like to know what happened here. Why was Jason Smith, a member of our Congress, ignored? Now, going back to Prince Harry's comment about the First Amendment being bonkers, now makes complete sense, as well as everything else he said after that. You see, in May of 2021, we just now started to see the exposure of the Aspen Institute and Harry being a part of this commission. Not knowing yet, because we didn't find this out until last year, that the Aspen Institute is a part of this censorship industrial complex. We also didn't know that all the people that Harry had been aligned with in 2020 are also a part of this censorship industrial complex. And at the time when Harry and Meghan and Renee DiResta and Safia Noble and Rashad from Color of Change, all were a part of this engine that was unofficially part of the Biden campaign to influence the election. So Jason Smith is correct. Harry and Meghan, as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, because this is how they presented themselves, did interfere with the U.S. 2020 presidential election. It's all here in the Supreme Court case of Missouri versus Biden. In the 900 pages, it describes how the government, Biden campaign, as well as social media platforms colluded together in order to suppress Americans on divisive topics such as elections, such as COVID-19, and as well as the plan to make this a permanent thing. So, the beginning of seeing this kind of censorship started in around early 2020, same time when Harry and Meghan left the UK. So, fast forward into June, we see Meghan all of a sudden with her bestie Glow, and then all of a sudden, Harry's talking about misinformation and then saying that we're supporting Stop Hate for Profit and trying to get Facebook to not run ads and demonetize people. And what do you know? In the same month, the Biden Harris campaign is doing the same thing to Facebook. Is it a coincidence that the Surgeon General, who is also a main part of this lawsuit, is also aligned with Jory Craig? You know, the one that Archwell paid $120,000 for consulting? We all know that Meghan and Harry in 2020 were meeting with tech executives, and we do know that her hires included one from Pinterest. So there's no doubt that there was engagement here and they knew what was going on and were assisting with this. They were supporting the Biden campaign in getting him elected. And being that this proved to be so successful, they decided to continue on with it. As you can see here, coming into the new administration with now President Biden's political allies in control of both houses of Congress, social media companies were on clear notice that the federal government's involvement in social media censorship was likely to escalate, and their threats of adverse legislation, regulation, and legal action became more ominous. And that's exactly what happened. If you think back to 2021, Harry announces he's on this Aspen board and he's writing a report on misinformation. Then you had all these accounts being taken down from our community at the same time. Murky Meg, Yankee Wally. You saw a whole list of people on Twitter being deplatformed. This is not a coincidence, folks. This was a part of this censorship industrial complex. This control the government had on social media was such a godsend for the Democrats, and they wanted to keep it going. So who better to put in charge of getting this governance board together than Alejandro Mayorkas, the one who is refusing to give any information around Harry's application? It's been a few years that I have actively been watching and studying this, analyzing, reading what is happening, what Meghan and Harry are doing, how they're tied to the rest of the world. And it's becoming more and more apparent and undeniable at this point that the heavy influence in all of this mess that we have going on is Barack Obama, particularly with this border crisis. The surveillance, as well as the censorship, also influenced by Barack Obama. You see, Alejandro Mayorkas was there with Obama from the beginning. He was responsible for successfully executing the DACA program, which encouraged more illegals to flood the United States under Obama. Alejandro left when Trump came into office, but now he's back to finish what he started. Thank God Elon Musk bought Twitter, because had he didn't buy it, we would have never known that the government was by proxy using the social media companies in order to censor Americans for disfavored or malinformation, which is truthful information but doesn't necessarily align with the political agenda. So my final thought on this, on what Harry said back in 2021 about the First Amendment. So yeah, at the time, he's like, wow, it's bonkers. I didn't know that the government can't silence and suppress American free speech when it comes to talking about certain issues. But what they had been doing essentially in what he said here, but you can find a loophole in anything. Well, that's exactly what the government did. And that was strongholding the social media companies, either by threatening them with legal action or threatening them that they would put legislation around Section 230 And this last sentence where he says, I believe we live in an age now where you've got certain elements of the media redefining to us what privacy means. And that could take on the form of, yeah, that means Americans are going to have to give up some of their privacy. This is something that Renee DiResta, media companies redefining privacy. Absolutely. That means how much data is going to be shared, what's going to be learned about you, and whose hands is it going to fall into. He's not talking about him and his bitch wife getting papped. He's really talking about who's going to buy your data and how they're going to sell you things or how they're going to use it. Or even more sinister, how is the government going to use it to control you? Even though America is in bad shape, I think it could be worse. I do believe crisis has been averted as a result of all of this being exposed. Can you imagine this guy, Alejandro Mayorkas, being the head of Department of Homeland Security, responsible for disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and monitoring and surveilling the American people for that?
Do you think the Steele dossier included Russian disinformation?
Senator, that's not a question that I'm equipped to answer.
It was in the public news. It was you may have heard of it, the Mueller investigation. It was a $32 million investigation that went over a couple of years. Horowitz was an investigator general, and he looked at the FBI's activity in the beginning of this. And what the FBI concluded was that there were FBI agents throughout this period of time who concluded that, yes, the dossier was full of Russian disinformation. So let's say it is Russian disinformation. You say your new disinformation governance board is going to help the public with disinformation. You claim it's not going to be about domestic, it's going to be about foreigners and those evil Russians. So here's my question. The FBI concludes that the Steele dossier was full of Russian disinformation. CNN propagated this disinformation gladly for years and years. The difference, I guess, between your opinion and our opinion is that as despicable as it is that CNN propagated this disinformation, I wouldn't shut them down. I wouldn't lecture them. I wouldn't put it on a government website that CNN's wrong for propagating disinformation. The problem you have is you're not even willing to admit, I mean, we can't even have an agreement on what the FBI said was disinformation. How do you propose that you're going to have an office of disinformation governance if you see the problem in even determining what is disinformation?
Oh, Senator, because our work is not focused on disinformation writ large. Where we, the Department of Homeland Security, become involved is when there's a connectivity between disinformation and threats to the security of the homeland.
Well, that's what the Russians might be considered that. You mentioned the Russians the other day when you tried to pivot away from this being about censorship. But let's say it is the Russians. I know you're not going to ever agree that the Steele dossier, which y'all spent so much money on, was disinformation. But it was, and the FBI concluded. But let's just say there's an imaginary disinformation. You've discovered tomorrow Russian disinformation that's going to hurt our national security, and CNN's broadcasting it. What are you going to do?
Senator, let me...
You're going to tell Putin, you shouldn't do this.
Senator,
what are you going to do?
Senator, let me explain what we do in the Department of Homeland Security with respect to disinformation, and frankly, what we've been doing for nearly 10 years across different administrations. The cartels propagate disinformation that Title 42 does not apply to a particular community of migrants from a particular country.
How are they propagating this?
If I may, through social media. And what we do through U.S. Customs and Border Protection is actually communicate via social media and other channels that is false, that we do apply Title 42.
So let's say there's Russian disinformation as well. Are you going to take to social media and broadcast that people are broadcasting something incorrect about what do you think is Russian disinformation?
Senator, let me emphasize...
Well, you said the other day Russians, and now you're saying not so much the Russians, you're saying the cartels.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not, Senator. You're mischaracterizing my statement.
Then what are you going to do if there's Russian disinformation? You're going to broadcast something on social media?
Allow me to share when we become involved in the Department of Homeland Security. We become involved when disinformation poses a threat to the security of our country. It is when there's a connectivity to a threat to our country. It could be a threat, connectivity to violence. And what this working group does, is precisely what I would think you would want it to do, which is to take a look at the disinformation work that our department has done and ask the following questions. Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have
Yeah,
standards
but here's the
to
problem.
ensure-
We
if I
can't
may,
even
this is
agree.
an
We can't even
extremely-
agree what disinformation is.
This is-
You
well-
can't even agree that it was disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media?
Senator, I have 2 points, if I may finish. Number one, that what this office, what this working group does, because it's not an office, what this working group does is ensure that there are guardrails.
Remember, Megan used the same word, guardrails, at that mental health summit with the Surgeon General. They're all singing from the same choir.
Definitions, standards to make sure that the free speech rights, the civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy rights of individuals
So
are
do you
not
think
impinged.
do you think
Number
COVID
one.
do you think
And number
COVID do you think
two,
COVID
if I may,
disinformation threatens our national security?
And number two, if I may, Senator, and number two, is it your proposition that when the cartels spread disinformation with respect to our immigration policies to try to lure vulnerable migrants to our border illegally?
I think you've
that
got
we
no
should not
idea
take
what
action?
disinformation is, and I don't think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation. So I do have a question, and here's the question. So the Russians, maybe some cartels. What about COVID disinformation? Is that in your bailiwick for your disinformation governance board?
Senator, you would have to give me the details with.
Okay, here.
2024 is going to be spicy. But let me know what you think. Definitely leave your thoughts below. As always, I will be back with more content. But until then, please be safe, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
You're such a fraud.